All right, so by virtue of getting started, that's me. Nobody cares. Moving on. The purpose of this particular presentation is essentially to give you guys kind of a beginner's look of MeteorJS. So the first question is going to be, how many people have looked at or played with Meteor before? Okay, if your hand is up, you may be bored. I'm warning you now, so that you have an opportunity to go catch something, I don't know, post-agile or whatever. I will be the first to admit that I am not the world's biggest Meteor expert. I discovered it probably about 2 years ago when they were still very much in flux in beta. And I've been kind of keeping an eye on them ever since. I find it an interesting tool. I have not used it to, as the British say, I've not used it in anger. I've not shipped anything with it. I have built a couple of prototype type things for myself, so I have a little bit of knowledge of what I'm talking about. But like I said, I certainly don't work for Meteor. I'm not an expert. So choose wisely. The idea essentially is that Meteor is an all JavaScript stack. It's one of the first products that really tried to embrace the idea wholeheartedly that we have JavaScript in the database, aka Mongo, we have JavaScript on the server, aka Node, and we have JavaScript on the client. Sorry, I wander around. This stationary microphone is not going to work. So if we have a lavalier mic, I can use that. But well, okay, you can anchor me to the podium and we can see how well that works. Do you have a ball and chain? Yeah, so, because I do like to point to stuff occasionally, so I'll do my best, but I'm not going to make any promises. So like I said, we're trying to essentially embrace the idea of JavaScript entirely across all three common tiers, the database, the server, and the client. Now, in the beginning, Meteor was, they sort of had their own front-end style framework-ish thing, and then of more recent, they've actually embraced both Angular and React. So in some respects, you can decide which of these three you care to use. With their own thing, which they call Blaze, you can use Angular or you can use React. All right? I have some experience with Angular. I've played around with Meteor's Blaze. I've spent a little bit of time with React, but for the most part, if you're familiar with any of those three frameworks, you kind of want to understand how stuff works. The key thing to understand about Meteor is the fact that it embraces the idea that this is all one stack, okay? We are very much in sort of the I don't want to say anti-REST space, but we're very much stepping away from the idea of the client and the server as two separate components. Meteor very much wants to give you a development experience that says that this is entirely unified, that you don't see extremely visible places where one goes from the other. We still want to demarcate between the two. There are going to be a number of places where Meteor will say, this is what's running on the client and this is what's running on the server. We never want to lose sight of that. But at the same time, we want to work from within one source base. That is really the heart and soul of what this thing is trying to do. Develop in one language. Can you guess which language that would be? Actually, Meteor does have some, the documentation does talk a little bit about using some of the alternative JavaScript languages, aka CoffeeScript. They haven't really gotten on board the TypeScript bandwagon yet. That may be coming in a future release, but for the moment, they're saying, look, you're doing JavaScript or you're doing CoffeeScript, and that's all you really want to do. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here because by JavaScript, they mean JavaScript, HTML, CSS. So you don't quite get away from the HTML and the CSS world, but for the most part, you know, the intent here is very much a developer-focused tool. It's about writing code. It's about creating components, that sort of thing. One of the things that they also embrace is what they call data on the wire. They do not want to ship presentation information back and forth. They want to ship data back and forth, which is actually a very RESTian kind of principle when you stop and think about it. Well, actually, I should stop. Roy Fielding would not consider that REST, because he actually said you ship the presentation as a part of it. This is why it's always distributed hypermedia. But in the bastardized form of REST that most of us end up using, aka APIs using HTTP and JavaScript and JSON and so forth, it's very much in that spirit. As a matter of fact, as we talk about Meteor, we'll get to this a little bit later, one of the things that they do is they actually take your HTML templates, as they call them, and they compile them, if you will, into JavaScript, and then you import those from within your code. So they are very much of the mindset that says the only thing that's traveling on the wire back and forth is data between the client and the server. Embrace the ecosystem. We're JavaScript. That means we love Node. That means we love NPM. That means we love JSON, et cetera. This is actually relatively recent. In some of the earlier forms of Meteor, prior to its 1.0 release, they're up to 1.3 now. In prior forms, they said, we are our own ecosystem. And as a matter of fact, the only way you could start using Meteor realistically was to deploy to their cloud. They had MeteorApp.com, and so you could create, very Heroku-like, you could create myapp.meteorapp.com and deploy stuff there, and you used their command line tool to do it, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of people wanting to use Meteor basically said, no, that doesn't really work for me. I kind of want to deploy it where I want to deploy it, aka Heroku or OpenStack or any of these other node-friendly cloud platforms. Or I want to deploy it to my own data center. So as a part of the 1.0 release, Meteor embraced the idea that, yes, you want to deploy it to any NPM-compatible environment. And as a result, they've also embraced the idea of the larger NPM ecosystem. They have created their own ecosystem, their own Meteor-specific space, which they call Atmosphere. By the way, brace for all of the meteorological puns. Just like Java had Java beans and .NET has to do .everything. In this space, it's all about cosmos and planets and weather and all of that kinds of stuff. So their ecosystem is called Atmosphere, which is not a replacement for NPM, it's a supplement to it. We'll see a little bit of that later. The last point, full stack reactivity. This is one of the more subtle points of Meteor. They are trying to be fully reactive in the spirit of the Reactive Manifesto. It's not actually something they trumpet really loudly in terms of their marketing documentation, but it does show up in terms of how they manage data and so forth, back and forth. In terms of the buzzword bingo, pure JavaScript, live page updates, data synchronization, latency compensation, hot code pushes. This is all the stuff that's found, in essentially some of the marketing pages on the Meteor website. We do see hot code pushes, so as you make updates to the Meteor code, if the Meteor application, the Meteor server is running, it will automatically refresh the browser. That's pretty typical in the JavaScript development environment space. Running in a privileged environment, they are very sensitive to the notion of security. And one of the things that traditionally has tripped up some of these full stack experiences is the idea that, code can run on either the client or the server, who cares? It's all just one environment. Well, no, there's a lot of stuff I don't want present on the client anywhere because anybody can just fire up the Chrome debugging tools or whatnot and have a look at what's being stored in memory, et cetera. So they've actually taken that very seriously. When you deploy a Meteor app, when you first create one, by default it is insecure. And as a matter of fact, the package that does all of that is called exactly that, insecure. And so if you decide that you want to take greater control over what gets pushed to the client and whatnot, you literally do a Meteor remove insecure. You remove the insecure package from your code. And then you have to specify what will get shipped and what won't, et cetera, et cetera. All right. From a outside the Meteor bubble perspective, it's a classic mean stack. It's Mongo, it's Express, it's Mongo in the database, it's Express on the server. It can be any of Angular, React, or Blaze, as I said, on the client, but it's a pretty classic JavaScript stack. So in that sense, they're not really reinventing anything all that strongly. Getting Meteor installed is pretty straightforward. If you're on a Mac or Linux, you just run a shell script off the internet. That can't be harmful, right? It's over HTTPS. That makes it safe, right? It's even better when they suggest doing this with sudo, which is what they did in some of the earlier versions. Yeah, sudo, just this random script over the internet. Trust us. It'll all be okay. I don't particularly agree with this style of installing software, but it does seem to be becoming one of the more prevalent ways of doing things. And to be fair, I actually looked at the shell script at one point, and it's not doing anything harmful. It's actually just pulling stuff from their server to your machine and then putting stuff in the place where you would imagine it. However, if you are a paranoid software developer, which you should all be, by the way, then I would strongly suggest taking a look at the shell script before you install, just to make sure that it's not doing anything harmful. Fortunately, in later versions, they've removed the need to do a sudo style requirement, so now it's just installing under like user local bin, which is typically pretty safe, and it's not gaining access to anything sensitive, etc. All it's really doing is it's dropping a command line tool called Meteor onto your machine and making it available off the path. So once you've run the script and you've installed Meteor, the next step is just to verify that it's there, Meteor -- version, pretty typical thing. And as of currently, let's see, hang on, I want to, so, whoops, let me fling this guy over here. So if I do like so, that's the current version that's installed on my box right now, which is as of 2 months ago. Okay? Now, if you have particular applications installed, the Meteor tool itself doesn't require updating, but if you do a Meteor update, this will actually look to see what's installed currently, right? Looking at your application, what version of Meteor is currently installed, and it'll update it accordingly, right? If you do it outside of a Meteor application, it says, hey, this is already installed, right? Run Meteor update inside of a particular project to update it to 1.3.2.4. This is, for the most part, going to be your vector into the Meteor universe, is the Meteor command line tool. Okay? Again, this is very similar for a lot of JavaScript style packages and so forth. Everything kind of runs through here. In many cases, for example, if you want to access the, if you want to get at the Mongo database, there's a Meteor command that will allow you to do it. If you do a little spelunking, you can actually figure out where the Meteor server is running, because Meteor will launch it, where it's running, what port it's on, and then you can use standard Mongo tools to get at that if you so desire. So they're really not trying to hide anything from you. They're just trying to create sort of a nice umbrella over a variety of different tools and create sort of a unified experience for being able to get at it. All right, so. And of course, if you're on Windows, you download an MSI, or in this case, it's an exe, and run it because, hey, you're just running an executable. You download it from the internet. How harmful can that be? Right? Fortunately, again, Windows will, of course, do the prompt you, are you really sure you want to do this, which we all, of course, just click through and say yes. How hard, how damaging can it really be? And this is why Windows is insecure. Same story, though. Once you get Windows, once you get this on your box, you have a Meteor command line tool. You can do all the same stuff. So from after the installation, everything from that point is pretty much unified across both platforms, or all three platforms, depending on how you want to count. Now, Meteor has a number of different examples, and as a matter of fact, the Meteor documentation will, it kind of lies to you in some respects. If you do a Meteor create, and it'll say down here that there is an option here to create, to use some example templates, right? And so you think, all right, cool. Let me go get, whoops. Meteor create. Let me go get a list of all of the examples that Meteor will let me install just right straight from here. Because that's like one of the easiest things to do is grab one of the example apps and start poking around with that. Oh, wow. There's like 8 of them. This is pretty cool. So let me do this. Meteor create example to-dos. To which it responds, yeah, go git clone it. I'm not a huge fan of this particular style of user interface. Yeah, we're going to give you this thing as soon as you git clone it. These are all, as you can see, simple to-dos, because the to-do list is the universal hello world of all JavaScript applications ever, right? So that's why they have like 5 of them. And then there's a local market, a leaderboard, and then the clock. The clock is actually literally just a clock. It's a demonstration that says, look, you can still do all of that fun client-side JavaScript-y stuff. In this case, they're creating an SVG that will move the hands every second. There's no data exchange. There's nothing really Meteor about it. It's just demonstrating that you have access to all of the capabilities of the browser. Okay. They also have, let me, They also have a fairly decent, oops, there we go. So they have a fairly decent website here. Let me come back to the root of the site here. All right. So again, install link telling you to basically run the script or download the exe. And then the tutorial here. And the tutorials actually, there's some fairly nice ones. So that's an interesting little offset there. And as you can see, there are 3 different versions of the ToDo app, whether you want to do Blaze or you want to do Angular or you want to do React. And then there's also some additional applications that people have created and contributed just to kind of give you an idea of how you might build different kinds of things. For the most part, the site here is pretty nice in terms of documentation, in terms of the guides and so forth. They've broken the documentation setup here into tutorials, guides, and API docs. And then, of course, you have the classic forums, right? Stack Overflow also has a lot of Meteor-related questions, et cetera. So a lot of this stuff is pretty easily accessible to you as a developer, assuming you have some background in JavaScript. And in particular, assuming you have some background in ECMAScript 2015, the so-called ECMAScript 6 release. How many of you are really, really familiar with ECMAScript 6? Okay, good. Then I guessed correctly. Creating an application, pretty straightforward. Meteor create hello. This will create a particular directory structure on your machine. There will be a client directory and a server directory. Does anybody really question what those are for? Wouldn't think so. There's also going to be an imports directory where Meteor is actually going to figure out which of this code should go to the client, which of it should go to the server. There's some pretty strong conventions around this directory structure. So if you're going to play with Meteor, follow their lead, because otherwise you're probably going to screw something up. There's some very specific rules, for example, on the order in which some of these files are evaluated, the order in which some of these HTML files are transformed into JavaScript, the order in which they are auto-imported. All of that stuff is documented pretty nicely in the guides. But for the most part, just follow their lead in terms of how they want you to structure things, because otherwise you may accidentally be creating more problems for yourself than you really intend. So if I create a hello application, this is what my main HTML looks like. This is the scaffolded thing. And we see something that's not too unfamiliar, right? We see a title, we see standard HTML stuff. You've got the double curly brackets, which is the universal symbol for something magical is going to happen here, right? And then you can see some links down here across the bottom to the standard. It's pretty standard scaffolded application 101. The code, well, you know, those imports don't look like anything you've ever seen in JavaScript before, unless you've been studying ECMAScript 6. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can see an onCreated event, you can see some helpers, you can see some events. On the surface of it, yes, this is not rocket science. This is not trying to program in Haskell or anything like that. This is, in fact, pretty JavaScript-y. And we do see a reference to a reactive var, which will do pretty much what you would expect. As you increment this value, it will publish the fact that its value has changed to anyone who is interested. So anything that's basically bound to that, such as down here, counter return template instance counter.get. Every time that gets updated, it's going to be notified, et cetera, et cetera. All the reactive goodness that you expect out of the reactive manifesto world. Okay? Now, if you do create the application, of course, you're not going to be able to get anywhere until you actually create this, until you actually pull down all of the dependencies. So let me actually do, there it is. So let's see, where am I? Go to AMS. So Meteor, create, hello. And you can tell it's doing something because we're alternating between a forward slash, a backslash, and a hyphen. That's progress bar in command line speak, right? So now, again, there's my package structure. And the standard package.json, which looks pretty familiar to anyone who's ever done anything in the NPM JavaScript world. Again, they're trying to build off of this existing ecosystem. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? Excuse me. So then it becomes an npm install. And at this point, we go fetch most of the internet, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that got installed here. Actually, that's not too bad. It was longer before. Okay? And then, if I just fire up Meteor here, what it's actually going to do is it's going to fire up several different processes in the background. One is going to start up a Node Express server running on port 3000, if I'm not mistaken. It should tell us. And the second is it's going to fire up MongoDB. Okay? So at this point, I will have a working application. You can also see it's doing some work to the code. It's minifying it, it's collecting it, it's doing all of the standard things you would want a JavaScript application to be doing. So in addition to this being your principal administrative command line tool, Meteor also becomes your build tool. And depending upon what packages you have installed, it's also your deploy tool. They're really funneling everything through this one application. So if I come over here to the browser and I say new tab, because I don't have enough yet. There we go. Look, I can click the button and it increments a counter. And you've never seen this before, ever. It's an amazing demo. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I live to impress. All right. So, we already did all of this, etc. Now, because I sort of made the perhaps unwarranted, but as it turns out, correct assumption that a lot of people have not spent some time with JavaScript 6, and Meteor really embraces this in a big, big way. So if you're not familiar with ECMAScript 6, it's going to trip you up in a number of places. Trying to do Meteor with ECMAScript 5 is already deprecated, right? If you're trying to do it using traditional, for example, they fully embrace the ECMAScript 6 module system. That's what you saw earlier with the imports. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes and try to whip through the, ECMAScript 6 stuff. There's a number of different features that ECMAScript 6 offers, some of which we care about, some of which we don't. So this is just kind of a list, and then we'll drill into it directly. If, by the way, you want to experiment with ECMA 6 and you don't necessarily want to buy into Meteor, there are a couple of ECMAScript 6 transpilers which are available that you can use for any JavaScript style application. Tracer is one, Babel is one, and then of course Mr. Gamma's favorite, TypeScript. All of these are very, very close to ECMAScript 6, although nothing is completely specification correct yet. Some of them are very close, some of them are closer than others. But these three are all pretty close. So for the most part, if it's an ECMAScript feature, these guys have it. All right. So syntactic changes. We now have binary and octal literals. Everything is now Unicode based, so that if you really wanted variable names in Klingon, you can have those too. Awesome. Template strings. This is actually kind of an important feature because it allows us to do string interpolation, first of all, right? We get this. And notice, it's kind of hard to see. I'm stepping away from the mic. It's kind of hard to see, but notice console.log frames, it's the back tick. Okay? It's not the single tick, it's the back tick. This is how ECMAScript is going to know the difference between a standard character string and a backticked string. This is going to be hard to see, and this is going to be hard to remember. So be prepared for a number of, like, why isn't this working? Stare at the code at 11 o'clock p.m., trying for hours to figure out until somebody else comes by and says, dude, why do you have a regular tick there? It's supposed to be a backtick. At which point, you throw yourself out the nearest window. Right? So don't do that. Keep that in mind. Let and const. One of the things that ECMAScript has kind of come to embrace is the idea that declaring variables is a good thing, and more important, declaring the difference between mutable and immutable variables is important. So we have let, indicating I'm declaring a variable for use, and then we have const, indicating that this should never change. Okay? I would strongly advise getting into the habit of using these two as you start using ECMA 6, because in some cases there is word that the interpreters who are seeking to get faster, they will actually be able to optimize some of your JavaScript code more efficiently if they know it's a const as opposed to just a regular variable that can be modified. Default, rest, and spread parameters. You will see this a fair amount inside of Meteor code. So here, for example, we see default parameters. Index A is set to 0 and index B is list.length. This is pretty straightforward. Rest parameters means anything after the first one here can just be a 0 or more number of arguments. We already do some of this stuff in JavaScript, but now they've formalized it as part of the language. So items here will effectively become an array, similar to what arguments is in classic JavaScript. And then the spread parameter is actually kind of twisted because it's the opposite. It goes in the opposite direction of rest parameters. So here, actually, what I can do is if I have ... numbers, you notice that's at the point of call rather than at the function declaration. ... numbers, that array will effectively be picked apart. And each member of the array will be satisfying one of those parameters up there in add. So numbers bracket 0 will get passed for x, and numbers bracket 1 will get passed for y. And anything remaining in numbers will just be ignored, as it would for any JavaScript application. There's also a little bit of function shorthand, right? We can also use arrows for function bodies. We have a this that actually makes sense, which is good. There are a few semantics that are different. Some of this Meteor doesn't really take advantage of. For example, symbols, they're interesting, but Meteor doesn't really use it. Destructuring assignment. This, depending on which package you're using, Meteor may or may not take advantage of this. And again, if you've been experimenting with some of the other languages running on the JVM or on the CLR, some of these features you will already be familiar with. If you're not, well, the slides are here if you want to go back and look at them. There's also lots of material these days on what's in ECMAScript 6. I would suggest you take a look at it. Iterators and for of. So we can actually create our own custom iterators at this point, what some of the functional languages will call streams. Right? So here I want to create an iterator of an array, which already exists in the language, but this would show how you might do it. There are also generators. How many people are here, how many people have seen C# yield return? Show of hands. Just a couple. Same basic idea as yield return from C# 2. The idea is that this will generate values and yield them each time. Notice the function star. That is not a typo. That is the actual syntax indicating that this function is yielding up a generator rather than just a traditional return value. Under the hood, the interpreter has to keep track of where we are in that sequence of 4 items. This is effectively the same thing as creating an array of values and then handing an iterator back to those values, which will get picked one at a time. If you're familiar with Java streams, this is going to be something you will see as well. And of course, you cannot talk about streams and iterators without doing an example in Fibonacci. So there you go. Is everybody suitably impressed? Excellent. Then we will move on. This is not really a language thing, but the idea is that ECMAScript interpreters are going to be more sensitive to tail call recursion optimization, which is a good thing. Now, one thing we will see a lot of in Meteor is this notion of classes. Now, this is not classes in the traditional C#, C++, Java sense. These are not strongly typed classes. These are classes that still maintain their prototype-based relationship. Okay? So in this particular case, when I say that class monster extends character, what I'm saying is that there is an object in the world called monster, which serves as a prototype for other objects like this. And the monster prototype has a prototypical relationship to the character prototype, which has a prototypical relationship to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are not getting away from prototype-based inheritance. So everything that you read in Doug Crockford good parts, right, JavaScript the good parts, everything still holds. This is really just syntactic sugar on top of that mechanism. So that now I can say new monster as opposed to having to build a constructor function myself, which will set up those relationships, the prototype relationships. And it will have these fields, name and health and so forth, because I've specified them. In this case, notice I have two properties. One property with the getter and a setter. I've got a second read-only property, is alive. I've got a method called attack. It's designed to read a little bit more like classical languages. Okay? Meteor will take advantage of this in a lot of places. You will see people creating classes inside of Meteor code. Enhanced object literals, not so much. But there's one interesting feature that ECMAScript 6 will support that Meteor does not, at least as far as I know, does not take real huge advantage of. And I don't know that anybody's taking huge advantage of it. But down here across the bottom, here, I have what's called a computed property name. In other words, the name of this property will be evaluated at the time that this object is defined. And notice that I'm actually, as a part of evaluating the name, I'm using an arrow, a function literal, to yield the value 42. So this now becomes prop underscore 42 is the name of the property, which of course holds the value 42. Why anyone would really want to compute the name of the property at runtime, I really have yet to see somebody describe. I really just don't know why this feature is here. It strikes me as one of those, it's cool and we can do it, so why not? But it's there. Makes for a great interview question, by the way. Next time you really want to make one of your JavaScript interviewees cry. So just that. What will this evaluate to? And again, lock the windows, because otherwise, what? Anyway. Proxies, again, this is not really something that Meteor uses above the hood. If they use it below the surface, I'm not sure. I haven't found it. But this is the ultimate decorator, right? Again, in Eric Gamma, in honor of him, this is the Gang of 4 decorator pattern that ECMAScript has now standardized. There are a couple of library features that ECMAScript standardizes. So for example, we have a standardized map and set type. We have a standardized weak map and weak set type, right? So a set, of course, cannot contain duplicates. Maps, of course, are just key value pairs. This is all pretty straightforward stuff, right? So here we see a set. There's only 2 items in that set. One element hello, one element goodbye. And a Meteor code will make use of these libraries throughout the library. However, more often than not, at the surface level where you're writing, you will prefer the reactive types. Because if you're going to store data, you want to actually typically bind that to something that will want to consume that data. So there you'll use the Meteor reactive var, which is not a standardized part of ECMA 6. Promises, Meteor actually, interestingly enough, one of the best reasons to use it is that Meteor actually tries to hide a lot of the asynchrony away from you, which is really kind of nice. Meteor code doesn't march across the screen the way traditional Node and Angular code will. So the promises stuff is kind of buried under the hood where you don't really need to worry about it. The module system, it's kind of a big deal from the standpoint that in some respects they are simply standardizing what we've been doing by convention over the years, but they are using some language syntax to do so. So for example, Meteor has more or less deprecated the use of require and instead favors import. Now, require is still accessible to you because there are a few occasions where Meteor can't quite do exactly the right thing, and so you can still call out to require, and it will go do the traditional Node thing of go find that file, pull it in, and evaluate it, which can then yield an object back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still accessible to you. But Meteor, in several places in the documentation, says you really don't want to use require, you really want to prefer the ECMAScript import syntax instead. So here I have a module profile, right, that exports 3 different values. So these will be exported values from this particular module, right, exported properties, if you want to use the terminology exactly correctly. And then down below, you can see that I import those 3 by name from that file. Now, most of the time in Meteor, you will be importing from somewhere inside of the Meteor packages. So most of them will say import bracket some name from Meteor / package name, okay? Just like traditionally it was require package name, here it's import X from package name, right? Honestly, once you get used to the syntax, it really reads exactly the same way as a require statement does. The nice thing is simply I can get multiple values out of one import statement as opposed to having to get an object and then explicitly go to that object to get those values. Okay, so everybody's totally up to speed on ECMAScript 6, right? We're all good? Y'all? So the best part about this session, normally you go to a session and you can only put one new thing on your resume. Now you can put two. You are now an ECMAScript 6 expert and a Meteor rockstar ninja. Because it's not, I mean, you can't just be a rockstar or a ninja. You have to be both, right? All right, so back to Meteor. This is, there's, of course, a tutorial on the Meteor website for building a ToDo app. And so basically I figured one of the best things to do would be to simply walk through and show what we're doing in each one of those steps. This is, I strongly encourage you to, after this session at some point when you're back home, if you're interested in studying Meteor, go and do the tutorial by hand so that you can go through and get experience with using Meteor and kind of understand kind of how that space works. But, and hang on a second, yeah, there we go. PowerPoint kind of decided to hide my clock from me. All right, cool. So if you want to create a to-do app, right, first thing you do is Meteor create to-dos. That creates that file structure, etc. The second thing that they'll have you do is create an imports subdirectory. Again, this is not just convenience. This is not just something that the guy writing the tutorial thought would be helpful. Meteor actually keys off of anything in the imports subdirectory and will make it explicitly available to both client and server. There are a couple other directories that they key off of. For example, anything in a public directory will be considered to be a public static asset that wants to be referenceable from the client. Anything in the private directory will be considered to be a server-side asset that should never be delivered to the client. So for example, if you need particular configuration files, if you need particular passwords in order, for example, to access remote web services from the server, those should always go in the private directory. Whereas anything like your robots.txt and your favicon.ico and all of those other client-side goodies, those should all go in the public directory. Client and server are specifically where client and server code go respectively. And the imports directory is effectively where the stuff that's shared across both will end up. Okay? Now the second thing is we're going to want to create a body component, for lack of a better term. And I hesitate to use that word because components, particularly if you were in this track earlier today, you heard, React and many of these other MVC frameworks are moving to more of a component with an uppercase C style. We're hearing about web components becoming sort of an internet standard, etc. Meteor doesn't really go that far. Meteor likes the idea of components, but they're components with a lowercase c. The idea is we're not trying to necessarily create reusable binary things that you can share across a variety of different applications. They do talk about how to do that to a lesser degree, but it's relatively informal. This here is really more of an organizational. To them, a component is really more domain related. So here I want to create a body component that has some HTML and some JavaScript for the main page of the application and potentially for other parts of the app if we so desire. The first cut of this, of course, is to basically just list, using an unordered list, all of the to-dos that are currently inside of the list, which right now, by the way, will be empty because we have no data. And you notice, first of all, it's all standard HTML stuff, but you see the squiggly brackets, you see the handlebars. They actually don't use handlebars, they use space bars, I believe is what they call it. Again, meteorological, it can't be handle, it has to be space. So it's similar, the syntax is deliberately designed to be similar to other templating languages that use this format. So here you see curly bracket, hash each. Okay, anybody want to take a flying guess what this does? Yeah, you got it. It's a for each, and it will loop across what is presumably a collection of tasks, and then you see bracket, bracket, angle bracket, task. Well, that's going to load the task template, which we haven't written yet. Oh, no, wait, I take it back. It's right down there at the bottom. Notice we've defined a template for task that will list the text. Now, what is text? Text will be a property, a JavaScript property on the task object that we got out of the tasks collection. There's no rocket science here. The body JS code, here we see two import statements. First of all, we pull out the template from Meteor templating. This is because we want to define the body as a template. So specifically, we say template.body, and then notice helpers here. And then notice very carefully, we actually have a curly bracket and a curly bracket inside of the parentheses. What we are defining here is we're actually defining an object using object literal syntax that will have one member on it called tasks, which will in turn be an array of predefined tasks so that now we have some data. Notice that we import the HTML though. This is because, as I said earlier, what Meteor is going to do is it's going to take the HTML and it's going to transpile it. That is the proper term, by the way, when you're doing source to source. It's not compile, it's transpile. Impress your friends and neighbors. When you transpile the HTML to JavaScript, you can then import it into here and then reference it directly from within the code. Make sense? Cool. Step one, done. And this just basically says everything that I said out loud, in case you forget, like, next week when you're looking at these slides. Let's see, what else? Oh, yes. Inside of client, we want to define a main.js file, which for the moment is really straightforward. Just go grab the body. Okay? Client will have a main, server will have a main. This will be where you will put client and server related activities specifically. And here we see main.html. This is just basically where the header lives. Okay? It's pretty straightforward stuff. Now, of course, it wouldn't really be a to-do list manager if we didn't have some form of persistent storage. And again, for Meteor, this is Mongo. So now this is where you really start to get a sense of how Meteor is different from a lot of the other platforms you may have worked with. First of all, we just go ahead and grab Mongo. We import it out of Meteor/Mongo. And then I define a collection inside of Mongo called tasks. Now, look at the top of the box, import/API/tasks.js. This tells you that this definition is going to be accessible on both the client and the server. This is how we're going to be able to have this collection available to both places because, yeah, I mean, the server wants to be able to reference tasks for various server-related activities, partly because it needs to push it on into the database, but the client also needs to have access to it because it wants to display it. And from inside of the body here, notice that now, instead of having that predefined array of tasks, I just do tasks.find, which, remember, we just defined tasks. Notice the const. Once it's defined, it'll never change, but this is sort of in the traditional C++ style of const. What tasks points to will not change, but the contents inside of tasks obviously can. So we have now effectively received what is a Mongo collection on the client so that now I can just do tasks.find. And again, from traditional Mongo terminology, find with an empty object means find all of the objects in this collection, the end. Meteor collections are realistically just Mongo collections. And as a matter of fact, if you are a little uncomfortable with the extraordinarily dynamic nature of JavaScript and Meteor, Meteor actually does support the idea of putting a schema, aka Mongoose.js style, on top of your Mongo collections if you so desire. They don't show you how to do it in these tutorials, but it is in the documentation. They have a package, and so you can define to-dos as having text, incomplete, created, completed. You can have all of that defined so that any attempt to put data that shouldn't be on there will be flagged and it will create a validation error. okay? And there's no data because we haven't actually created any data. This is where, as a developer, if you want to just see that it all works, you can connect to the Mongo database by doing Meteor Mongo. And what effectively it will do is it will fire up the command line Mongo and give you the opportunity to do some command line Mongo shell activity to create a task into the tasks collection if you so desire. Make sense? Now, one question is, how do I add tasks from the user interface? Okay, well, if you were going to hazard a guess, there's probably going to be a form involved, and you're probably going to submit something, and Meteor is probably going to make magic happen. Yeah, okay, you got it right. So again, we put in an input field here. Again, the rest of this looks basically as it did before. I just typed some stuff in. And when you hit return, that's going to be an implicit submit. That's kind of the way data entry fields are supposed to work. So we need to define an event. And in here, again, imports UI body.js, template.body.events, and again, notice what I'm defining here is an object literal that uses CSS selector style syntax to specify the event and the actual entity in this particular case. Because notice I say submit.newTask, right? You see the CSS selector on the form here, new task. So this is how it's going to tie these two together, right? The submit is the actual JavaScript style event that I want to catch. And notice I get the event as a parameter. And so at this point, prevent default handling. You know, in other words, browser, please don't go ahead and try to reload the page, because browsers always try to be helpful and do that. But then I grab the event, I grab the text out of that text box, and then tasks.insert text, and then the time it was created. And voila, we now have data. Now, I realize I'm going through this fairly quickly. But if you're a developer and you're paranoid, right, your first thought is, what's that? No, not which date. No, because that's always going to grab the current time on the client machine, because this is all executing on the client. The server is not the client, which then begs the question, where's the database? That's correct. You could. What's that? I think you're missing a bigger issue, which is, how does the client get directly at the database? It's magic. It's real magic. It's exactly right. What's actually happening here is that Meteor is, believe it or not, you have to dig a while through their documentation before you discover this. They're actually running a package on the client side called Mini Mongo. They're actually running a lightweight Mongo database inside the browser. And so initially, when you're doing this, you're doing it inside of the client. And then they actually have set up a publish subscribe style protocol, what they call DDP, Dynamic Data Protocol. And DDP will go back and forth between the client and server to update the server system with this data. Now, you are experiencing one of two reactions. A, that's cool. B, holy shit, really? That's what they're doing? Depending upon your reaction will basically determine whether you ever touch Meteor after this talk. And that's the symbol for almost done. I have 10 more minutes. 10 more minutes. Don't be harsh in my mellow, dude. All right. So whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, this is certainly, that's debatable. That's going to be something that you're going to have to discuss with your colleagues and with your boss, et cetera. This is how Meteor works. Okay. Now, questions of, well, how do I intercept DDP? How do I, somehow try to get a hold of that? How do I expose DDP myself? The basic answer is you kind of don't. That's not the point of this tool. The point of this tool is to create an environment that looks like a full stack because you want to treat it as a monolithic full stack. Okay? If that is not your goal, then you probably want to keep going and look at something else. Okay? And that's, the Meteor guys are pretty much going to agree with that. They've said as much in a couple of public settings. So again, we define helpers here to say, good, let's grab the newest tasks, since now we have the dates that they were created, so we can always see the newest tasks first, right? Again, that's straight Mongo 101 up there, passing in a field, saying I want to sort the created at field in a reverse order. And if I want to update this, you can pretty much guess what this is going to look like. So now if you've completed, we want to have a checkbox. So notice we're going to say, okay, the double handlebars, the if, that does exactly what you think it does. So if this task is checked, in other words, if the checked property is on this task, if it's defined as true, remember if it's not defined, that's considered falsy, and therefore this wouldn't appear, right? Then we'll have a button, and the X here is simply the completed, right? It's just the, basically indicate that I want to delete this, hence button class delete, input checkbox. Then there's the text from earlier. This is all pretty much HTML 101, with the exception of the fact that where we're getting the data comes from the double angle bracketed Meteor object. And then inside of imports UI task.js, you can see, again, events. We're defining a click toggle checked so that now we can update whether this is checked, flipping it back or forth. And again, tasks.update, that is a MongoDB call. So this will go initially to the client-side mini-Mongo and then ultimately get updated in the server-side Mongo. But again, you as the developer, I don't care. It all just looks like one beautiful, happy, cloudish world. Okay? And I think I already did that. Right? Task.html is the task template. I've now broken it out into its own file, broken it out into its own JS file. That's just to keep these things from getting too big. Now, if I want to actually filter, in other words, I want checked items to be removed from the view, I can set up a reactive dictionary. And notice in this case, I put it in this .state. I don't actually want this to be on the server-side database. This is kind of a client-side cache. And so a reactive dictionary is basically a key value pair that has some reactivity to it. So that now, if this has in fact been checked, I want to hide it, so I add it as a hide completed, and then I check that value periodically. Instance.state.get, if this task has been hidden, then I don't want to display it. I don't want to see completed items. Again, this is reactive, so as it updates, it'll automatically update the user interface as well. Up the top, more. Here you can see we're referencing an incomplete count, which we get going back to the tasks. This is all pretty much the same story. Oh, but now I only want to allow tasks to be seen by particular users, right? I mean, a global task list, things that everybody has to, that's going to get really unwieldy very quickly, right? 7 billion people on the planet, all of them are using this app for tasks. Yeah, you know. And if I say that loudly enough, somebody will give me seed money, just, you know, because that's just the way the startup world works, right? Meteor, this is where we start tapping into Atmosphere. Meteor has this ecosystem of projects which are accessible to you. So in this particular case, I add the accounts UI and accounts password packages in order to be able to reference those. These are Meteor-specific packages. So that now, in my startup, I can say I want to config to say I want to have password sign-up fields, and the username only is a well-known constant from that particular package documentation. And then here down below, you notice the very bottom I have reference to a template called login buttons. And that's the only reference I really have to user interface management whatsoever in terms of a user interface. This will pop up the dialog box. Do you have an account? Do you want to create an account? It manages all of that for you. As long as you like the particular look and feel that they're using for that, it's beautiful. It's amazing, right? If you don't like it, well, then you can either go in and reference those templates and change it, because again, all of this is open source, right? From within the body here now, I can get a hold of the user ID and the user object, which will give me the username, right? And again, this is just inserting it into the database. So now my tasks will be associated with the individual that created them. And notice I import Meteor from Meteor/Meteor. The Meteor object is where we get a hold of some common sense objects, such as the currently authenticated user if you're using the Meteor accounts package. Okay? If current user is a Boolean flag indicating whether or not there is a user authenticated, and the rest of it is pretty much user interface. I want to hide it if it's not your task, and I want to show it to you if it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I stopped there. There's about 4 more steps in the traditional Meteor to-dos tutorial, but it's really more of the same. As you can see, the intent here is one code base, which Meteor will then partition and separate into client-side and server-side, giving you the opportunity to do things on either side of this divide as you so desire. But the intent is very much, it's one app. It's one code base. It's one environment, so program it that way. And you either like that or you don't. And if you don't, well, then you just wasted 45 minutes of your life that you'll never get back. But I gave you an opportunity to bail, so it's not my fault. Questions?
One question.
One question.
Basically, and it's other database than Mongo. How easy is that?
Right now, Meteor does not talk about any other databases other than Mongo. And the biggest problem for them is it would have to be a database that exposes itself in sort of a JSON style. Because again, we assume these collections are collections of JavaScript objects. So at that point, you'd either have to, like if you wanted to try to integrate an Oracle or a SQL Server, you'd have to masquerade the table as if it were a collection of JavaScript objects. But you saw exactly how much schema definition we did in this tutorial, which is to say none at all. So you would have to have a relational database table that consisted of a flexible number of columns, all of which were nullable, all of which could store anything, which at that point, why are you using a relational database? This is just, it's in that sense, Meteor is very, very opinionated. I could see them embracing Couchbase, CouchDB. I could see them embracing RethinkDB. If the relational vendors embrace JSON and sort of a flexible collections model on top of there, which the SQL Server team has talked about to some degree. If you're a Microsoft fan, Azure Document DB would fit well here as well. And so I could see the Meteor guys going after those databases, but unless the relational guys make their database look like a collection of JSON documents, I don't think you're going to see them inside of Meteor anytime soon. So again, if you like JSON databases, this works. If you don't, yet another reason to hate being here for the last hour. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Queuing the track chair.